Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Tuesday, July 29th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with Times of Israel founding editor David Horovitz. Hi, David.
Hey, Jessica.
Hi there. It is day 662 of the war. As tensions escalate over the aid situation in Gaza, U.S. President Donald Trump has said that Israel must do more about aid in Gaza. The European Union is proposing cutting Israeli access to research funds over the Gaza humanitarian crisis. And meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that Israel is working to ensure that large amounts of aid enter the Gaza Strip. We'll talk about his comments, as well as the coalition talk of annexation and occupation of the Gaza Strip, and what is happening right now with truce and hostage talks. Stay with us. Okay, so David, there's obviously intensive pressure and tension out there coming from the US, from President Trump, from Britain's comments, from EU countries regarding aid, all revolving around the situation of what is happening in Gaza, of possible famine in Gaza, of imagery. And the tensions are rising. It really feels like on a hourly basis, certainly on a daily basis. What's your sense of all of this right now?
I think you're right. This is an incredibly problematic situation. It's very unclear, as it has been throughout almost 22 months of war, what is going on in Gaza. There's no, as you know, there's no independent journalism in Gaza. The Times of Israel's military correspondent and other reporters are given limited access to Gaza. There are no international staff reporters that I know. There's lots of freelancers who are working in very difficult circumstances, and some of whom I'm sure are desperately trying to present things fairly, and others of whom may not be because of concerns about Hamas and all kinds of other complexities there. What we would say that we think we know is that hundreds of people have been killed trying to get aid, not only close to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation aid distribution sites, but in many cases there. There are allegations that Hamas is killing people. The Israeli army has acknowledged firing shots, and I would say basically acknowledged that people have died as a consequence, although it claims that the tolls are being exaggerated. And then now you have the growing concern about malnutrition and people dying of starvation. Again, very, very hard to know things definitively. But the fact is, for example, that between March and May, for about 11 weeks, Israel did not allow supplies to go in. I don't think Hamas suffered too badly because they had large quantities stockpiled. But since then, there has been not as much aid going in as had been the case before that 11-week period. In the last couple of days, Israel reversed policy as lots of photographs came out of Gaza purporting to show many cases of malnutrition, fatalities in some cases. One or two of the key photographs have been debunked, one in particular debunked by the Israeli Defense Ministry yesterday, concerning somebody with a genetic illness who Israel had coordinated his evacuation, a child's evacuation to Italy, where he's in hospital and has been for the past 6 weeks. So that was not a fresh photo of a child facing starvation, but rather an old photograph of a child with an illness who has been evacuated for treatment. And there are other photos that you don't know what to make of them. There are lots of photos, everyone has seen them, I'm sure, of people clamoring to get food at I think one of them is getting lentils at a food site in Gaza. And if you just look at the way the photographs are presented, they're curious, shall we say, that there are lots of a very prominent crowd with very small children and other people, but no depth to the crowd that you can see. In other words, you don't see like ranks of people, but you see these people squashed, and then there's a little space where the photographer has taken the picture. So they're squashed up against what? Because I mean, they're slightly curious. At the same time, there seems to be little doubt that there are people suffering, and Israel has acknowledged, the Israeli military has acknowledged, for example, that there is difficulties in accessing food. Now they're saying it's the UN's fault, that there is food for weeks and months. piled up on the Gaza side of the border, but the UN hasn't distributed it. And I think I wrote this last week. There are specifics about why it wasn't being distributed. Reportedly or allegedly, at least, the UN has asked to have armed gunmen escort convoys. Israel's not been willing to do that. I mean, there's a lot of back and forth in terms of blame. But the bottom line is that Israel changed policy this weekend. It was agreed in a meeting in which the two far-right ministers were not invited because it was held on the Sabbath. One of them has said, where lives are at stake and there's a war going on here, I would have come to that meeting. Itamar Gvir said that, and is plainly furious that Israel has restarted very widespread aid. And Netanyahu has said, we have to do this. The international community insists upon it. He's said that we've always allowed minimal, sufficient supplies to go in. I'm not sure that that's the case when it comes to the March to May period. But you've got a government that is plainly, on the one hand, trying to use every pressure tactic it can to get hostages out of Gaza, but at the same time is working in an international climate where President Trump is among the most supportive of Israel. But as you said yesterday, when he was asked about Netanyahu claiming there was no starvation in Gaza, in his initial remarks, he kind of said, I'm not sure about that, or words to that effect. And then later, he was hosting Keir Starmer, and he's in Scotland at the moment. Later in the day, he said, no, there's starvation in Gaza. Those kids, we can see it. You can't fake that. I'm not sure that you can't fake that, by the way, but his conclusion is that this is not being faked, and I think there's reason to believe. I don't think Israel is denying, as I said, that sufficient food is not getting to everywhere in Gaza, and therefore this very dramatic 180-degree reversal of policy by the Israeli government.
David, let me ask you a question. Netanyahu, we noted in one of our live blog stories that Netanyahu spoke in English in a press conference about this issue in order to make the statement that Israel, as you just noted, that Israel is getting more aid into Gaza. So, there's always this tension between the Hebrew media reports and what he might say, not that he does it a lot, though, what he might say in English to the press in order to get his messaging out. And that is on top of rumors that we're hearing about discussions of occupation and annexation of Gaza in the coalition. So what are we to make of that? In other words, it's sort of two different messages that are going on at this time. It feels like Netanyahu is saying, okay, we're going to get aid into Gaza because there's so much pressure and intensity about this particular issue right now. But at the same time, as you just noted, we're going to keep on doing what we think we should be doing in Gaza in terms of military pressure. Obviously, occupation is much farther than just simple military pressure. Does that make sense, my question?
Well, the confusion that you're alluding to is indeed the case. I mean, there are mixed signals and contradictory signals and tactical shifts and strategic incoherence, and we're all grappling with working out what is the Israeli government trying to do, what does it ask the army to do, what does the army think it can do and should do. So you're right to ask the question. Just what I'm saying is we're all asking these kinds of questions. For example, the army does not want to be in the aid distribution business, but the army is supposed to be securing access to aid, and therefore, when things go wrong, fingers are pointed at the army. If soldiers are not equipped with non-lethal crowd dispersal means, and tens of thousands of people are converging on an aid site, and they don't know if Hamas gunmen are among them, and they're very close. What are they to do if they feel their lives are in danger? And why are they being placed in those circumstances? Let's keep going. You mentioned that Netanyahu says some things in English and that he doesn't always say in Hebrew. I mean, I think probably in the case of the statements in the last few hours about lots of aid going into Gaza, that's him in English responding to President Trump's public demand, really, that every ounce of possible aid go into Gaza. So Netanyahu was addressing that. I don't think Israelis are unaware of that policy shift, but it's maybe not something he chose to highlight in Hebrew, among other factors, because there is a widespread sense, shall we say, that if you're allowing great quantities of aid into Gaza in an ineffectively supervised way, lots of it's going to find its way to Hamas, and that's going to relieve pressure on Hamas. So that's a concern for all Israelis, because the stronger Hamas is, the worse that is for Israel generally, for the hostages in particular, and so on, for the two goals of the war, radically degrading, destroying Hamas as a military threat, and a potential civilian governance, and getting the hostages out. And then, the other things you mentioned there, it's hard to reconcile. Talk of masses of aid going into Gaza, stalled negotiations on an interim truce, and ultimately an end to the war for the release of all the hostages, at the same time as unsourced reports are saying, first of all, that the army has proposed a tightened siege on Gaza. It's not exactly clear what the army is proposing. It's not exactly clear what the army thinks it's doing in Gaza right now. And then at a ministerial cabinet meeting last night, unsourced reports suggesting that ministers are discussing, I don't know, the occupation of all of Gaza. The army claims it controls about 75% of it already. Does occupation differ from the 75% control? And even annexation. Annexation is something of a different order. That's permanently declaring parts of Gaza to now be parts of Israel. How does that square with sending in lots of aid to enable Gaza to at least subsist, shall we say? I mean, there's a great deal of contradictory information. The political context is that Netanyahu has no government without the far right being Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich's parties, that Ben-Gvir has been publicly critical of the aid volte-face, but Smotrich has not. Smotrich, who is talking all the time about annexation, both in Gaza and the West Bank, including this morning, has been sort of siding with Netanyahu, suggesting that something that he considers to be beneficial is about to happen. There's even a claim that President Trump is on board with the idea of limited annexation in Gaza. I would treat that with great wariness. But we've been down some of these roads before in the context of the West Bank. Remember, in the first Trump term, there was this whole Netanyahu assertion, basically, that Trump was on board with Israel annexing parts of the West Bank if the Palestinians turned down Trump's peace plan. And basically, the Palestinians turned it down before it had been launched, and Netanyahu thought that he was now going to be able to annex parts of the West Bank. And then Jared Kushner came along and said, absolutely not. So now here we are 5 years later, and it's really only the last day or so that you've started to hear this, again, I stress, unsourced material suggesting that ministers are mulling annexation, and even one unsourced report, suggesting that Netanyahu thinks that Trump is on board with this. We've reported it. We have to tell people that this is what is being ostensibly said, but I don't know what to make of it.
Okay, let's take a break and talk about what is coming out of the EU regarding what's happening in Gaza, and as well as an update about truce talks and where we stand there. So stay with us. Okay. So then there's their threats, their warnings. What are they from the EU about, for instance, about proposing cutting Israeli access to research funds, about any of the statements that are coming out of the European Union, essentially saying to Israel, do something about humanitarian access in Gaza or else. Are we taking that as warnings, or do we think it's something more significant? And of course, there's also, I'm just thinking about a Facebook post I saw from a friend who is an academic at an Israeli university, and said an invitation to a symposium was reneged on because of the situation right now. He was supposed to go to this symposium, is not. And I'm sure there's other aspects of this happening, but again, all of it is just hearsay or what you're seeing and hearing in different places. So what do you think that all says, David?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's hearsay. I think there's sort of escalating pariah status for Israel. We've talked about this for many, many months. Really, we've talked about it ever since October the 7th, from very soon after October the 7th. But I think it's increasing, and I think the last few days were maybe another milestone in international perception of Israel as carrying out indefensible actions in Gaza. I think people are very internationally, but human nature, people are susceptible to images of children starving. And maybe some of these images are misrepresentations, and maybe some of them are not, but they've been on the front pages of newspapers and high on websites, and they show children in conditions that children should not be in, and people are moved by that, as is human nature, and their leaders are moved by that. And again, in an Israel where you have some in government and they've not been fired, you've got ministers in government saying things like, we're pushing the Gazans out and we're planning to render all of Gaza Jewish, as one minister said last week, and Netanyahu dissociated himself from him, but he didn't fire the minister. So Israel is certainly making it very easy for people to have the sense that its policies are deeply problematic. And you see this playing out in things like the recommendation in the EU towards, shall we say, excluding Israel from research projects. You see it in things like an Israeli cruise liner where was unable to dock at a Greek island a few days ago. A similar event did not happen yesterday with an Israeli cruise liner where the Greek police were alerted and made sure that the Israelis were able to disembark. But there is a rising tide of criticism of Israel, from public criticism, including more widely than the previous instinctive or assiduous Israel critics. We're talking about this spreading beyond people who are obsessively critical of Israel to people who think of themselves as reasonable, fair-minded people who are deeply troubled by the images that they see coming out of Gaza. And like I say, it would seem to be that a sort of another milestone has been passed, that this is an escalation of that mindset, a widening of that sense of profound criticism of Israel.
Okay, let's move finally to truce talks, which on one hand, the Israeli team is no longer in Doha, but the lines of communication seem to still be open. There's still discussion. The emphasis seems to be that they have not ended, that they are not lost yet at this point. What's your sense of where we are right now and where we could still get to with this latest round of hostage talks?
Well, there's a proposal conveyed by the mediators that Israel says it has accepted, and that the mediators say, I think it's fair to say, certainly the American mediators say, that Hamas has not accepted, that its response was not acceptable. And you have Hamas saying, we're surprised that they withdrew the teams because we want to try and make this work, and progress was being made. I mean, let's not lose any track of the fact that Hamas is a monstrous terrorist organization that is determined to wipe out Israel, and that remains the case, and is indifferent to the suffering of ordinary Palestinians, however many ostensible crocodile tears its leaders may be shedding. Right? This is a one mindset, intractable, destroy Israel, kill the Jews everywhere organization, and this is not theorizing. This is demonstrable. This is what happened on October the 7th. That was in the cause of that goal. This is the organization that was central to the strategic onslaught of suicide bombings 25 years ago. Let's not lose any track of what Hamas is. But Israel's strategy remains, as it has been almost from the start of the war, hard to fathom. There are two main goals of the war: destroy Hamas as a threat or as a military civilian capable force, and get the hostages back. And it's not clear that those two goals are complementary. Maybe the military pressure helps, but at some point maybe it doesn't anymore. That's not completely clear. And then, of course, you've now got this added goal that Netanyahu has taken for himself, which is the endorsement of Trump's vision, which Trump himself has kind of walked away from, of compelling all of Gaza, I mean, all the Gazans to leave. Trump certainly is not saying that anymore, but Netanyahu has put the implementation of Trump's vision as a goal of the war. If you're trying to work out where things are heading, the fact is that Israel does not seem to have any day after Hamas strategy for Gaza except the Trump vision. That's the one that Netanyahu has signed on for. He's rejected the idea of some kind of Palestinian Authority role, there can be no regional role in Gaza because I don't think the UAE or the Saudis are going to do anything unless there's the PA giving anything they do legitimacy. I think the Americans maybe feel a little similar to that, but the American position is whatever it might be today, it could be something slightly different tomorrow, depending on what President Trump chooses to say or to highlight. I mean, in February, he unveiled a vision of the enforced ouster of all Gazans. He has moved away from that, and it's not clear. I mean, he hosted Netanyahu not too many weeks ago, and Netanyahu spoke about being close to finding countries that would take Gazans in. I didn't hear President Trump saying that, for example. So it's very curious. Israel's government has endorsed a vision that the American president doesn't quite seem to be pushing anymore, and has not adopted any other day after Gaza strategy, even as ministers in the government are apparently talking about annexation and occupation. And in that context, Hamas is not going along with what Israel and the mediators would like it to do, which is, I mean, Israel certainly seems to want, the government wants a 60-day truce under which maybe half the living hostages would be freed, maybe 10 out of the 20, and seems to not want to lock itself into a process where it ends the war. And Hamas wants to be sure that the war comes to an end. So really, in that bottom line, things are pretty much where they have been for many, many months at the very least.
And we'll see what the rest of the day brings, I would imagine.
Yes, Jessica.
Okay. Thanks, David.
Take
And thanks for listening to the Times Visuals Daily Briefing. Stay tuned with us for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have, you can always drop us an email at podcast@timesofisrael.com. Of course, feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care and be well.